right. So you want me to go ahead and start?
I'll introduce you.
Okay, sounds good.
to our Miss Jessica.
Sounds good. All right.
And hopefully other people will come on as it goes. So Jessica, I'm speaking directly to you, I guess. But thank you for attending the Virtual Inspiring Abilities Expo. My name is Allison and I'm the Fuse board member. And so a couple things just before we get started. I am recording this session and it'll be accessible on the Fuse website. So do keep that in mind when sharing or asking questions. We don't want to have too much personal information out there. And then I will also be monitoring the chat box for any questions. And I think we're going to go ahead and do questions at the very end, just to kind of keep things in order. But please, as you think of questions or as you have them, go ahead and type them into the chat box and I'll make sure to give those to Jeannie at the end. And so, yeah, I am excited to welcome you to this morning's session covering Keep Growing Language, presented by Jeannie McMillan. Jeannie is a clinical assistant professor in the Department of Speech Language Pathology at Ball State University. She's also a First Steps assessment team member and has been participating and has been practicing speech language. Has been a practicing speech language pathologist for over 35 years. In addition, Jeannie is the current president of the Indiana Speech Language and Hearing Association. Hang on a second, honey. Specialty areas and areas of interest include early intervention, language and literacy, assessment, coaching families and caregivers, and interprofessional practice. Please help me welcome Miss Jeannie. Thank you so much for joining us today, Jeannie.
Absolutely. And Jessica, I think I'm just talking to you right now. So hopefully we'll get some additional people that'll join us. But I'm going to go ahead and go on with my presentation. So Jessica, I saw you say hi in the chat. So welcome. I'm glad you're here. All right. So Allison did a great job talking about me, and I'll just add a couple things that I'm a wife and I have 2 adult daughters, and a grandmother of 4. They range in age from 4 months to just turned 16 yesterday. So wide age range for those grandkids. I am passionate about children, their language skills and vocabulary across the lifespan. So for all ages, I'm kind of a word nerd, just for lack of a better phrase, about learning new words. And when I run across a word that I don't know, trying to figure it out, things like that. And the last thing is that I have no financial disclosure to share. All right, so just to lay our groundwork a little bit, did you know that learning new vocabulary is indeed a lifelong necessary skill? We all have to do it. We all need to engage in that process. And just some facts for you that I think are amazing to know. So according to Global Language Monitor, so that's monitoring the language around the world, there's a new word created every 98 minutes. So that equals 14.7 words per day. So roughly 15 new words a day that happen around the world. And I also think it's amazing to understand that there are over 1 million words in the English language. That is astounding to me. That's a lot of words. So just for a second, think about the last new word you learned. And, think about coronavirus. That's a word we didn't know 2 years ago. Before the pandemic hit. If you did, it was probably because you were into science or you're in the medical world or, something like that. If you knew that term before the pandemic hit, certainly COVID-19 is a new word within the last, 2 years. Most of us didn't know that or use that and had no idea what it was. That very well may have been the last new word you learned. It might not have been. And maybe you don't particularly recall the last new word you learned. But we are always learning new words and we always need to learn new words. So I think that those numbers are interesting and kind of lay the groundwork for what I'm going to talk about more today. All right, so just for fun, I wanted to share with you some new words that came about in 2021. So here's a list. I think I have 10 of them, and some of them you might know, some of them you may not know. So, you can, if you don't know them, you can say, hey, I learned X number of new words today. All right, so adulting. I feel like that's probably one that a lot of us have heard before, but it is the action of becoming or acting like an adult. I've heard friends say, I have to engage in adulting today, even when we are adults. It's kind of a way of saying, I got to do the important stuff, or I have to go to work, or things like that. Another word or phrase is awe walk. I didn't know what this one was. So it's taking a walk outside and making an effort to look at the things around you. I didn't know what it was, but I like it. Contactless. That's a word that came around for us because of the pandemic. So, if we have contactless picking up our groceries or, things like that, it's not having to physically touch or interact with people. Another word is doom scrolling, and that's reading the news on social media and already expecting it to be bad. So much so that you might become obsessed with looking at those updates and looking at any postings related to that particular topic of interest. PPE, that's an abbreviation for personal protective equipment. We can thank COVID for that being a term that we hear often. Another one that I did not know is quarantine, but if you pay attention to how it's spelled, it's not T-I-N-E, it's T-E-E-N, and that refers to a teenager during the COVID-19 pandemic. And if you are at all familiar with teenagers, you can probably understand why they need their own label, right? Thirsty. It is a multi-meaning word. So another meaning of that word is having a need for attention or approval. So that came about in 2021, a new meaning for that word. Truthiness, something that seems true, but is not backed up by evidence. Unconscious bias, unconscious prejudice against race, gender, or group. I think we hear that one a lot, and probably that was not a new term for any of you. And then the last one is WFH, or an abbreviation for working from home. So I gave you the site for these if you want, if you're just a word nerd like me and you're interested in, I wonder what new words are going to happen in 2022. They'll be posted there. All right, so new words happen all the time. I just gave you some data for that and some facts for that. So if you knew any of those words, just think with me for a second, how did you learn them? How did you know what those words meant? It could be that you heard them, somebody used that word, or you read that word. It could be that you just looked at the word and kind of made an assumption about what the word means based upon prior knowledge or based upon other words that you know that are similar in nature. I think the quarantine one is a good example of that word that you could, if you've never heard it before, you could pretty much guess what that particular word is referring to. Where you learn them is often important, because oftentimes we learn a word that is specific to the setting or specific to the context. So I feel like a good example of this is your job. So if you are employed, you probably have words that you learned because of the nature of the tasks that you need to do related to your job. And then also, do you use them? If so, when, where, and with who? do you use these words? Because that is important. Knowing and recognizing, okay, so where did I hear that word? What situation was I in? Oh, I remember. I heard that when I was talking with so-and-so. So that often kind of reminds you of the meaning of the word, or helps you to make an association with that word, and also helps you to retain it. All right, so what I want to do next, since I've laid the groundwork, is talk briefly about how we learn language. And this is pertinent for children and adults. So across the lifespan, this is how we learn new words, or we learn to expand our language. The first key point is comprehension of spoken language. You might have heard that referred to previously as receptive language, but we have kind of moved beyond that, particularly in my field of speech language pathology, and we often refer to it as comprehension of spoken language. So comprehension of spoken language precedes talking. It precedes the expression. It develops first. It comes first. So for me to be able to use any of those new words that we talked about, it's important for me to comprehend them first. I need to understand what they mean. So to use a word or concept in talking, we have to first understand the meaning. We retain and learn new vocabulary with repeated exposure. It's essential for us to encounter that new term or that new word multiple times before we can own it. We can use it. We can say, I understand this word and I can use it in conversation, or I can use it when I'm talking with someone else. So it's not a one and done kind of situation. And what we know from the research is that language is best grown in a context. And often that's an experience, that's a setting, that's a situation where you are in and you hear or see a new word. So comprehension comes first. We got to understand it. Just a little bit more about experiences as it relates to vocabulary. Experiences are essential for growing our language, for learning new words. And our first experiences are often routines. So, for young children, we're talking about daily routine kinds of things, like setting the table, or going to the store, taking the dog for a walk, playing a game. Those routines help to build vocabulary. Particularly if the person who is engaging in that routine with the child takes advantage of that moment to do a lot of talking and to expose the child to a lot of different words. One little brief comment about going to the store. I know some of our younger ones have been deprived of that over the last couple of years, and maybe haven't had that experience very often or frequently enough to associate vocabulary with that particular event or experience. So again, repeated exposure is important for us. One of the things that I always like to share is that experiences don't need to be fancy. They don't need to be expensive. They don't need to be a big event. I just gave you some routine experiences. Those are free things. Those are things that you typically might engage in every day. And so we can take advantage of those. And we also want to remember that language is grown with repeated exposure. So those repeated routines are prime for doing that, for providing us with the opportunity to learn that vocabulary and make it our own. We also have to acknowledge that those routines and experiences change with age, and so do the language skills that we need. So, as adults, our routines and experiences are the things probably that I've listed at the top, because those are things that we have to do to get through our day. But we also may encounter new routines and experiences, and we have to be mindful of the vocabulary that goes along with those new things. Okay, so the second part that comes after comprehension is the expression part. And the expression part doesn't have to be spoken. It can be sign, it can be gesture, it can be use of a symbol, it can be alternative communication means, so like a device, it can be written, it can be a text. Expressive skills take many, many forms. So a lot of times I think people just think about talking, but that is not our only means of expression. And what we know is that expressive skills lag behind comprehension of spoken language. So again, we have to make sure that we understand or comprehend new vocabulary before we feel comfortable using it or saying it, signing it, using a symbol for it, writing it down, texting it. So we have to make sure that we understand it first. Our expressive skills develop and grow, again, based upon experiences, vocabulary, and the concepts that we experience, and repetition, overall repetition. Expressive skills, like comprehension skills, are experience or exposure dependent. We have to encounter them. We have to interact with them. All right, the third area of language that I want to just review a little bit is what we call pragmatics. It's also known as social language or social skills. And it's just as important as comprehension and expression. It's how we use our language, spoken and unspoken. So unspoken might be facial expressions, might be body posture, just a lot of different things that we could do to supplement our language, but it's the use of language in social settings or when communicating with another. And pragmatics are oftentimes situation dependent. I think we would all agree that the language we choose to use and our facial expressions and body language are very different if we're talking to someone of authority. So if we're talking to our boss, or if, let's say, we just happened to meet the President of the United States, our language and our body posture and things like that would be very different than if we ran into a friend on the sidewalk and we, stopped to have a conversation. So our language is oftentimes situation specific. So one of the questions I have here is, do you recall the settings where you first learned about the pandemic? Because the setting is important. In thinking back to my own experience, I think the first time that I really had to encounter talking about the pandemic or listening about the pandemic is here at the university where I work. So, we were hit very hard with what are we going to do? And how are we going to keep classes going? And why does it matter that we shouldn't be face to face, and things like that. So that was a very different discussion and a very different use of vocabulary and language than a setting that my husband and I were talking about, the pandemic and the language that we chose to use with each other, and also, extended family. So settings often dictate how we talk about something and what we learn as far as vocabulary goes. So I hope that makes sense for you. So let's talk some strategies. How do we begin to tackle that million words in English? And I'm not saying that you need to, I'm just indicating that how do we grow our language, our vocabulary, and the vocabulary of our children. So what are some strategies we can use? The first strategy is be the play-by-play commentator. So think about the sports broadcasters that, if you're watching football or you're watching basketball, and they just talk about everything that's going on in the game. So, if you're listening on the radio, you can visualize, you can understand exactly what's happening because they're giving you a play-by-play. So as a parent or someone who is helping in a situation, assume that role. So during routines and events, be the commentator. And you can do that by labeling or naming everything. You can also enhance your vocabulary. So use vocabulary that's rich. So if you're talking about, if you use the term big, and you say, you know, wow, dinosaurs are big. Look at this dinosaur in this picture. He is enormous. Wow, he's gigantic. So you're using additional words that have the same meaning as big, but you're exposing them to that advanced vocabulary level. You also want to repeat that vocabulary throughout the experience or the routine so that they get those repeated exposures. They hear it again and again, and they see it within the context. So it helps them learn, it helps them understand what the word means and also retain it. You also want to make sure that if you're being the play-by-play commentator, that you describe words for not just labels, but it's also important that you use words that talk about things like feelings, space, so time, location. Those are important words for us. And often those are words that are left out when we communicate with our children. So we want to make sure that we include those or talk about those things and they hear words that go along with that. One of the things that I always want to caution, and in my role here at the university, my students hear this a lot from me when they're working with a little one or even an adult, is you don't need to ask questions. Life's not a test. So when you're being the play-by-play commentator, you don't need to say, what did I just say? What word did I just say? What does big mean? It's not a test. You don't need to ask those questions or review that. You're just exposing them to listening to and experiencing that particular word. So try to limit the questions that you ask. You do want to answer questions as they come up. So if the person that you're engaging in this routine experience with asks you questions about it, certainly answer those. And think about the vocabulary that you choose to use in answering back. Make it rich, make it full of new words. Adults, if let's say you're at work and you have a new coworker and you're trying to teach them aspects of the job, you still want to be the play-by-play commentator, right? Because you're walking them through that. Know that adults learn the very same way. That's how we learn new terms, new vocabulary. We might ask more questions than maybe children do, but sometimes not. Oftentimes adults are going to look it up later. They don't want to admit maybe that they don't know the word or the term. So they're going to make a mental note. Hey, I'm going to Google that later. And that's okay. That's okay. All right, let's look at strategy number 2. Strategy number 2 to grow language is related to books. And there is a ton of research out there that talks about the importance of exposure to books for growing language. Books can take on a wide variety of type. So, and it doesn't necessarily mean that you need to read the book to the person. You can also just share it. And sharing a book means that you're just talking about it. So you don't necessarily have to read word for word what the text says in the book. You can just talk about what you see in the pictures of the book, particularly if you're doing this with a young child. But books open up a limitless possibility of new vocabulary. So what I have listed here in 1 through 7 is kind of a hierarchy by age. So with our little ones, we often start with picture books, and they're often the board books, so they're cardboard books. And a lot of those picture books are going to have people and places and things for us to talk about. Those picture books are a rich opportunity to use varied vocabulary. So labeling happens very naturally with those books, but it's also good to talk about other things than just the label. So, if it's a picture of a bus, you could already begin to talk about that. Hey, you know what? Sometimes we call these vehicles. A bus is a vehicle, a car is a vehicle, and sometimes we call them transportation. And transportation means it's what we use to get from place to place. So this bus is transportation, it's a vehicle. So just talking through that when you're looking at those picture books. Wordless storybooks might be the next step that you go to, and wordless storybooks have a lot of appeal. So it's books that don't have text, it's just the story is told by the pictures. So in sharing that book, you can make up your own story using the pictures as a guide, or have your child help you make up that story. And you can expand their sentences and use more words, more vocabulary. Of course, storybooks. Storybooks are typically the ones that we're going to read to our children. But we can just talk about the pictures as well. Most of them are going to have pictures to go along with the text. Chapter books are for our older kids. And, oftentimes these are assigned by their classroom teacher. And, it could be that the whole class is reading them together. It's a good routine to get into, to just check in with your student about, hey, I know you're reading a book about, whatever the topic is, and tell me what you read about it today. And then, maybe talk about what they think might happen next, or what part of that did you like? Were there any new words in that book? Can you find it for me? Can you show them to me? Let's talk about them. Number 5 is books on topics. So a lot of our kids have special interests. They really are captivated by special topics like trains or dinosaurs or insects or things like that. So capitalize on that special interest and expose them to specific vocabulary that goes along with it. And books are often a good way to do that. I would say that, if I were engaging with a child that is interested in insects, I'm going to have to get a book because I don't know a whole lot about insects. I know the common ones, but I'm sure there's way more vocabulary that goes along with insects. So I think a book is going to help me and the person that we're engaging in that experience together. Novels for older kids on a variety of current topics. So for older kids, I think, there's a lot of serious topics out there that go along with being a teenager and or middle schooler. And I think, having conversations about those things and making sure that the comprehension is there and that they're comfortable in using the vocabulary that goes along with those is really important. And then for adults, of course, reading material can be a wide variety of things, but novels, websites, magazines, again, Google. Google is our friend, right? So we can do a lot of checking in with Google and reading up about certain things. We know not to believe everything there is posted on Google, right? So we can use Google, though, as a resource. All right, strategy number 3. Books are one of my favorite strategies, but second would be games. And games go across the lifespan, and it's a fun, engaging way to build language and vocabulary, no matter your age. So I've kind of put these in a hierarchy as well, according to age. So, with our younger ones, we do matching and sorting games. Perfect opportunity to talk about and expose to color words, size words, shape words. So, in my world, we refer to these as adjectives to describe. So those are awesome ways to expose a child to those words. Sorting games are naturally good for categorization. So if we're sorting the pictures of clothes and food and things like that, then we want to supply the label. Hey, all those things that you wear that you put over here, we call those clothing. And all those things that you put over here that you like to eat, we call those food. And those are actually all fruits, or those are all vegetables, things like that. Seek and find, or hide and seek, great games for talking about location or preposition words. Oh, where did you put that? Did you hide that beside my chair? Did you hide it under my chair? Look, I'm going to put this next to. So, talking about those location words hide and seek or seek and find routine, it lends itself very well to vocabulary exposure about place. Card games. Card games are fun, and card games have a lot of language embedded within them. So it's not just about the game itself and what you need to talk about and what you need to understand, but it's also the social part, the pragmatic part, in playing that game with someone else and asking questions and maybe having somewhat of a debate or, that time or negotiation, things like that. So they're great for vocabulary. Made up games. A game doesn't have to be something that is purchased or something that you've played before. Kids are great about making up games. And oftentimes they're their favorite because they made them up. And so tying in vocabulary with those silly made up games that they like to play, just kind of pre-thinking or thinking through as you're engaging with them, what words can I use here? What can I expose them to for this made up game? There are commercial games that you can purchase, of course, for older individuals and some school age kids, crossword puzzles. Some people like them, some people don't, but they're great for vocabulary exposure. There's typically two types of crossword puzzles. So there's the kind that, is in a newspaper. And they're not really in the newspaper all that much anymore, unless you get a big city newspaper. But those are pretty much random vocabulary. There are also commercially available ones, or even if you just do a Google search, you'll come across them online that are theme-based crossword puzzles. And by that, I mean all of the words that you're going to use to complete the crossword puzzle all come from the same topic. So perhaps it's a crossword puzzle about the pandemic, or it's a crossword puzzle about scuba diving. So that's a great way to help with vocabulary retention and vocabulary growth, because you're able to associate, okay, all these new words that I'm using to fill out this crossword puzzle all have to do with scuba diving. So it helps us brain-wise categorize that vocabulary to retrieve it much more easily later. Okay, this slide just has some commercially available games that are rich in vocabulary expansion, vocabulary building. But I do want to say, just because I'm talking about these, it doesn't have to be a commercially purchased game at all. These are ones that are focused on vocabulary, and some of them have a junior version, which is for younger kids, and some of them have an adult version. Taboo, Categories, Tri-Bond, those all have junior versions and adult versions. And I provided you with the website if you want to look at that list. If you're thinking about a Christmas gift, that might work on vocabulary or, something like that. All right, so strategy 4, what else can we do to build vocabulary? We can play with words. And I've provided you the link for that. So some of these things you might remember doing in school. So, just playing a what am I game with someone or your child and saying, okay, guess what I am? I am in the sky. I only come out when it's dark. I shine. What am I? And, they might say the moon, they might say a star, whatever goes with that. So there was a lot of rich vocabulary there and helping them to think about what's mom or dad describing for me here. I Spy, that's an older game. I spy with my little eye something that is, and you describe it and they have to guess what it is. Analogies, you probably remember those from school. So just as an example, boot is to foot as glove is to hand. Classifying and describing things. So again, that's categorization. That's really good for vocabulary development and exposure. And then also, what could you use to? So, it might be, what could you use to wash your car? What could you use to reach that box way up on top of the shelf in your closet. What could you use to? So coming up with multiple things that you could use. I might be able to use a chair. I might be able to use a ladder. I might be able to ask Dad to lift me higher, things like that. And then strategy number 5. This one you've heard before. And for growing language, what we know from the research is that it's important to limit screen time. You've heard it before. Notice I didn't say eliminate screen time. I'm not one to say that needs to happen, because it's not in our society today. It's just not possible. So, thinking through how you can maybe minimize or reduce the time that you yourself are on your screen, and, those that might have some language concerns. What we do know from the research, the American Speech, Language, and Hearing Association and the American Academy of Pediatrics have said in countless research studies that handheld screen time is linked to delay in expressive language. So for our kids who are already struggling with language, we do want to minimize that time, or just be very conscious of how we can use that screen time. Other studies have shown links to better cognition when screen time is limited. Oh, and I will say that these last 4 are for us too, or for adults, that, engaging in a lot of screen time tends to make us more sedentary in our day. So we're not very active. It can have a negative impact on social skills, and that's for all of us. If children are highly engaged in their screen time, then they're missing out on interactions with live, real people. For the most part. Same thing for us. When we get, I always say I fall down a rabbit hole if I'm looking at Instagram, and the next thing I know, 15 minutes have passed, and I could have engaged in a conversation with my husband, or things like that. Also, we know that for kids and adults, it does disrupt your sleep routine. It disrupts the quality of sleep that you engage in because of the screen time. So I'm not a proponent for eliminating it. I just think that there are ways that we can think more strategically about how do we want to use it. Strategy 6 is talking about current events. That's extremely important across the lifespan. So, things happen in our world, good, bad, and ugly. And oftentimes we need to have conversations about those. So the first thing we want to do is make sure that everyone has the same background information. So when we're talking with our children, or we're talking with a group of people about something that is a current event, we want to make sure that everybody has the same background of information about this topic. We also want to be ready to provide explanations and clarification when questions come up. And we want to do that in an age-appropriate manner. So, sharing what is only appropriate for the age. We also want to provide space to experience emotions about that current event. We've had a lot of current events in the recent, last couple of years that bring up a lot of emotions and a lot of things that we all need to talk about, and we need to find the words to talk about those things. For number 2, well, for 1, 2, and 3, I often think back to 9/11 for my own daughters. One was in 5th grade and one was in 1st grade, and they were in school when 9/11 happened. And so, I wanted to get up to speed with what did their teachers tell them? What do they know? And to ask for them to feel comfortable with asking questions about it when we came back together as a family, and also allowing them to talk about how are you feeling about this? You also want to answer questions, and you want to make sure that you check back later. So it's an ongoing opportunity. The person knows, hey, you're a safe place to talk about this, or we can talk about these things. And current events don't, like I said, don't have to be scary. They don't need to be the bad things. They can be the good things. So we want to make sure that that is part of conversations that we have. All right, so I'm looking at the time, making sure we can get through this. Top tips for learning new words. Most of this I've talked about before. So just to summarize, you want to use lots of repetition of the words in as many different settings as you can. You want to maybe decide to hone in on a relatively small number of words if it's a new experience or if it's a new setting, so that the individual is not overloaded. But when they experience that same thing again, you can add additional words. You oftentimes need to explicitly discuss and describe what those new words mean. You also want to provide opportunities to encourage them to think about, well, what do you think this word might mean? So, when I talked about the quarantine, and thinking about, oh, I know I have some root knowledge about quarantine. So, I can figure out what this means. You want to give multiple opportunities to use that new word in different contexts. But again, don't ask questions. You just want to give them those multiple opportunities in situations. Encourage them to say the word often. You yourself use the word often. Make the conscious effort to use this new word in your conversations. You can also help build a clear representation by discussing different aspects of that new word. So these terms are speech pathology terms, but we can include what it means, what the new word means. So that's a semantic clue, the meaning of the word. We can talk about what it sounds like. So that's phonological. So that's the sounds within the word. We can show how it fits within a sentence, meaning we can use that word in a sentence for them grammatically that would show the context or the meaning. And we can also show them the spelling. So what does it look like when you see it in print? The last one, where one of the strategies is dictionary skills. I would replace that with probably Google words, because many of us don't look at a dictionary anymore. We're going to Google it, right? So taking a look at clarification when a word is not understood. I feel like this is important when a word has multiple meanings. So, thinking back to one of my earlier slides, the word thirsty has multiple meanings, and sometimes we don't think about teaching all of the meanings that go along with the word. So Googling it is going to help, or looking in a dictionary if you want to pursue that. Multiple exposures, talked about that. Relating words thematically. So for example, if you're teaching the word dinner, you can talk about that it's a meal, that family are involved, and we have food, and it happens in the evening. We have to cook first so that we can have tasty food to eat. So you're talking about that new word in conjunction with words that they already know, and you're setting the stage for when you could use this word. We also could talk about words in what's called a taxonomy. So for example, strawberries, and we just talk about, strawberries are a berry, they're fruit. It's a kind of food, and they're grown, and oftentimes they're red when you eat them. And then also what I've talked about before in showing what the word looks like when it's written or when it's spelled. Research has shown that that does increase knowledge of a word, and it does help with pronunciation, meaning, and spelling. All right, so just to kind of bring us back full circle, why does any of this matter? Why does it matter that we always continue to grow our vocabulary or our language skills? Well, research supports that it's closely tied to success with reading skill and comprehension for our young learners. Vocabulary is extremely important for success with that. And it's also necessary for being able to use written language. We have to have good vocabulary to do that. It's important for interactions with others, our social skills. It allows us to communicate ideas, thoughts, and feelings. And it's necessary for communicating with a variety of people in a variety of different settings. And lastly, it's important for occupational success. All right, so question and answer, or if you have any comments or thoughts to share. I also will just point out that I have some resources available, and then also some references there for you. I also have my contact information if you would like to contact me or you have questions about anything that I talked about today. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen, Allison, and we'll see what we've got.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Jeannie. I know Jessica just said that she'd love to get access to your resources. So having your contact information is going to be great.
Okay.
I really appreciate you taking the time and, you know, sharing with us. I mean, I always learn so much whenever I hear from a professional. So I really appreciate your knowledge. Yeah.
And Jessica, thank you for joining in. You too, Allison. Thank you.
Yeah. Jessica, did you have any other questions that Jeannie could answer now? Oh, great. Okay. So Jessica is an advocate with InSource. All awesome.
Perfect. Perfect. Yeah. Absolutely. Myself and some of my colleagues are more than happy to assist with anything related to advocacy.
That's great.
Okay.
And I'm sorry for having my video off. I was in commute.
No, you're fine.
But it was very informational. And I'd love to get your info to stay in contact if I have any questions, just with the work that I do, but also I'm a parent of a child with an IEP as well.
Okay, absolutely. I would love to stay in touch as well.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you for listening.
Great. All right, everybody. Well, thank you so much. And Jeannie, again, we appreciate the time.
Sure.
So I'm going to go ahead and stop recording. Jessica, thank you again for joining us.
Absolutely. Thank you both.